Right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Rod Dubrow-Marshall. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University and the Lead for Equality and Diversity in University Executive. I'm really honoured and pleased to be introducing our guest speaker this evening, Peter Tatchell, who many of you will know, I'm sure, has been campaigning for human rights in this country and internationally since 1967. He's known to many as a champion for human rights, LGBT freedom and global justice, including through the work of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. And I know for many people in this country and across the world, Peter is a vivid and vivacious symbol of the ongoing struggle for LGBT human rights and the struggle to overcome oppression and discrimination. And I think he gives all of us who believe in true democracy and freedom from persecution and oppression a great deal of hope and the strength to follow his courageous and tenacious lead, which is why I'm so pleased, as I know we all are, to welcome Peter to the University of Derby. Thank you very much for being with us for LGBT History Month. And really, it's over to you at this point, Peter, so thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm really delighted to join you for LGBT History Month. Thank you all for coming. And tonight, we wanted to have a sort of a combination of me speaking, but also some Q&As and contributions from you. The theme of tonight's talk is the global struggle for LGBTI freedom. So the starting point has got to be, what is the state of LGBT rights globally? Well, for a start, we know that in nearly 80 countries, male homosexuality and sometimes also female homosexuality are totally illegal in all circumstances, as is being transgender. And people who do not fit the heteronormative model of what it's to be a man or a woman, who have same-sex relationships or have a different gender identity, risk harassment, victimization, possibly even imprisonment. We know that in these nearly 80 countries, the penalties for same-sex relations range from a few years imprisonment right up to life imprisonment, and in 6 or 7 countries, or parts of countries, there is the death penalty for same-sex relations. So the global picture is quite grim for literally millions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people. We're talking about roughly a third of all the countries in the world have laws criminalizing same-sex relations and gender identity that does not fit within the norms of those societies. And it means that for literally millions of LGBTI people worldwide, they live in fear. Fear of prejudice, ostracism and rejection, at the minimum, and at the worst, fear of arrest, torture, imprisonment, mob violence, and even execution. What is, I think, truly shocking in this day and age is that even today there is no international human rights convention that explicitly guarantees equality and non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Not any international human rights convention, not even the European Convention on Human Rights, which is often held up as a world leader. Now, it's true that to some extent existing conventions have been interpreted in certain domains to protect LGBTI people. So in the 1980s, the European Convention on Human Rights did not protect in law or in court judgments the human rights of LGBTI people. There were several British cases taken to the European Court of Human Rights on grounds such as the age of consent, housing, immigration, and mental health issues. In every single case in the 1980s, the European Court ruled that LGBTI people were not covered by the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, thankfully, that has changed. Particularly from the 1990s onwards, the European Court has acknowledged that the equality and non-discrimination provisions of the European Convention do apply on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, that's not because there's any explicit, specific protection. It's because Article 14, the right to non-discrimination, and Article 8, the right to privacy, have been interpreted to include LGBTI people. So in Article 14, it lists various grounds in which discrimination is prohibited: sex, race, marital status, language, ethnicity, and so on. It doesn't mention sexual orientation or gender identity, but it does say at the end, or other status. And at last, in the 1990s, we were deemed to fit within the remit of or other status. And that's why in 1999, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the British ban on lesbian, gay and bisexual people serving in the armed forces was unjust, unlawful discrimination. So it's fairly recent that the European Court has taken this move. Obviously very welcome, but it's fairly recent. We know that when it comes to the United Nations, there for many, many years was a total obstruction of any kind of positive commitment to LGBTI rights, even though the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all the member states are signed up to, does say that everyone is entitled to equal rights and protection against discrimination. In fact, it wasn't until 2008 that the General Assembly considered a statement or declaration in support of LGBT rights, and that was the first time ever the General Assembly had considered the issue, and 67 countries signed up to that statement. It wasn't binding or mandatory, but 67 countries, a very clear minority of the, I think then, 192 or 93 member states, signed up. Most did not. But that was progress, because never before had the General Assembly considered the issue. However, previously, the Human Rights Committee in 1994 ruled that in the case of a gay man in the Australian state of Tasmania who was subjected to a total criminalisation of homosexuality, punishable by a maximum sentence of 21 years imprisonment, the Human Rights Committee ruled in 1994 that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is an expansion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does cover sexual orientation. And that ruling led the Australian state of Tasmania to decriminalise a male homosexuality. So there was a precedent even before the 2008 General Assembly statement. Closer to home, the Commonwealth of Nations is one of the biggest offenders when it comes to the persecution of LGBTI people. As you know, the Commonwealth prides itself as an association of nations committed to human rights, democracy, equality, non-discrimination, personal freedom, and the right to privacy. Yet, 41 of the 53 member states still have a total prohibition on homosexuality. 7 of them have life imprisonment, such as Guyana, Tanzania, Bangladesh, the Gambia, and so on. In two of them, two Commonwealth member states, Pakistan and Nigeria, in certain regions where Sharia law holds sway, LGBTI people can be put to death, can be stoned to death. Now, these are members of the Commonwealth, which some years ago, only a couple of years ago, agreed a Commonwealth Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which the General Secretary of the Commonwealth has indicated does apply to LGBTI people, although we are not specifically written into it. Again, there's this other status clause. The General Secretary has said, in his view, other status does include non-listed grounds such as sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, my question is, if the Commonwealth has got a charter which clearly defends and upholds the principle of equality and non-discrimination for all Commonwealth citizens, why is it that 80% of Commonwealth nations are allowed to discriminate and, in fact, criminalise sexual relations between people of the same gender? Why don't we hear strong condemnations from the Commonwealth Secretary General? Now, he made his first ever declaration in support of LGBT rights in 2011. I wrote an article for the Guardian newspaper exposing and decrying the failure of the Commonwealth to speak out against anti-LGBTI abuses. The Commonwealth Secretariat was so stung by that rebuke and the bad publicity and the negative lobbying they got as a result that the Secretary General, to his credit, did make a statement in which he said that, in his view, sexual orientation discrimination was incompatible with Commonwealth values. He said sexual orientation discrimination, but not gender identity. So it only got half of the message. But anyway, that was a first. No other Commonwealth Secretary General had ever made such a statement. I'd been lobbying the Commonwealth for decades, for 2.5 decades. Every preceding Secretary General refused to make a declaration in support of LGBTI human rights. Every single Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting refused then and even now to even discuss LGBTI human rights. They will not allow it on the agenda. It can't even be discussed. That's the scale of homophobia that exists within the Commonwealth, despite this purported Commonwealth Charter. So it's very, very clear that much work is to be done within the Commonwealth. Just take an example of some of the kinds of penalties. In Trinidad and Tobago, the maximum penalty for same-sex relations is 25 years imprisonment. In Malaysia, it's 20 years plus flogging. And you've probably heard that the main opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim, has recently been again sentenced for the so-called crime of sodomy to several years imprisonment. The Commonwealth is a real problem. It could be a voice, a forum for engagement, dialogue, negotiation and change. But when they won't even allow it to be discussed, what hope is there? So I'm quite pessimistic. But ultimately, of course, I'm confident and optimistic that things will change. It's just that they're taking a very, very, very long time. Many of you will be aware that in the last few years there has been a great homophobic, biphobic and transphobic backlash across many parts of the world. In fact, in about 15 or so countries, there have been moves to introduce new anti-gay laws, or to recriminalise same-sex relations, or to enforce existing laws with ever greater harshness and ferocity. So the countries I'm talking about are countries like Russia, India, Cameroon, Uganda, Brunei, Chad, Nigeria, Zambia, Malaysia, Burundi, the Gambia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Kyrgyzstan. In all these countries, things are going backwards. As I said, some of these countries are planning or seeking or have introduced new anti-gay laws. There's a new bill going through the parliament in Kyrgyzstan to outlaw the promotion, the so-called promotion of homosexuality. In other words, any advocacy for LGBT rights, any support around safer sex for gay and bisexual men, any defense of lesbian and trans women who are victims of either homophobia, transphobia, or misogyny. When you look at Brunei, a member of the Commonwealth, has announced it plans to phase in Sharia law with penalties of stoning to death for people who have same-sex relations and for women who have sex outside of marriage. In Cameroon, the laws there are being enforced with greater zealousness in the last 10 years than in the previous 30 or 40 put together. There are at least currently somewhere around about 10 men in prison for consenting same-sex relations, or even suspected, not proven same-sex relations. Because in many of the instances when these men have been jailed, there has been no proof that they've actually had gay sex. There's evidence that they are gay, but there's no proof they've actually had same-sex relations. You may remember the case of Roger Mudbedi, who was jailed some years ago, I think for 5 years, for sending a text message which said something like, "I love you," to another man. He wasn't jailed for having gay sex, for sending a text message. And eventually he was released to undergo medical treatment, but died sadly not long afterwards. You're all familiar with the anti-gay law, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, that was introduced in Uganda, and now the new anti-gay law that has been introduced to replace that one because it was ruled unconstitutional by the court. In Russia, the law there to supposedly protect minors against non-traditional sexual relations, the reality is it's all dressed up as a campaign against paedophilia, but the reality is LGBTI people across the board are being victimized. People are being arrested and convicted for holding up a sign saying homosexuality is normal. All across Russia, LGBTI teachers are being sacked from their jobs, not because they've mentioned homosexuality in their classes, but simply because they're gay. So there's this real, escalation in Russia, which is not only legislative, but also in public attitudes. There's escalating levels of mob violence and the deliberate luring and entrapment, mostly of gay and bisexual men, but sometimes lesbian and transgender people as well, to rendezvous where instead of meeting a prospective partner, which they thought they were dating online, they meet a right-wing nationalist mob who beat them, torture them, and humiliate them. And this goes on with the tacit endorsement of the Russian state. So far as I recall, no one has ever been brought to justice for these crimes. There may have been one case which was proceeded against, but I'm not too sure whether it was ever successfully prosecuted. But there are loads of other cases where the attackers have been visibly identified. The people that actually filmed these attacks. So it's easy to trace who did the filming, who put the film online, and still no prosecutions. If we look at other countries, such as the Gambia has just introduced new draconian anti-gay laws modelled on the failed version of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda. And the president has variously threatened to crush gay people like mosquitoes, to behead any homosexual, a whole series of very inflammatory and bigoted threats against the LGBTI community there. So things are grim in some places. And even in countries where there is a degree of, well, a considerable degree of enlightenment, it varies in different parts of the country. So Brazil and Mexico have in many respects quite progressive laws on LGBTI issues. But both countries also had right-wing vigilante and death squads which pursue a policy of what they call social cleansing to remove from society what they call undesirable elements. And LGBTI people, particularly trans people and sex workers, have been targeted very, very heavily for summary executions. Within societies that are otherwise, in many parts of the country, very open and progressive on LGBTI issues. Some of you may have read the report by the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission last year, which highlighted the ongoing terror campaign against LGBTI people in Iraq. A terror campaign that has been continuing ever since the fall of Saddam Hussein. Now, I've got no brief for Saddam Hussein. I'm glad he's gone, although I never supported the war, but I'm glad he's gone. But nevertheless, under his reign, homosexuality was not approved of, but LGBTI people existed in a sort of quasi-legal limbo where, providing they were discreet, they were not affected. Since his fall, with the rise of Islamist militias, and in particular the Shia-dominated government of Nouri al-Maliki, there has been an escalation of mob violence against LGBTI people, including targeted militia snatch squads going to people's homes and workplaces, dragging them out and shooting them dead in the street. And that is still continuing today. Last year there was a new wave of killings of LGBTI people in Iraq, which this International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission report detailed and documented. I mean, some of the kinds of grotesque things that were done were super gluing the anuses of suspected gay men, feeding them laxatives, which caused them to, well, they died. They couldn't defecate. They died horrible, ghastly deaths. Another example, I was working with some of the underground LGBTI activists. There were two lesbians in the city of Najaf who'd set up a safe house to provide refuge for gay men on the run from militias, and in particular from young boys who'd been forced into the sex industry. Somehow, the Islamist militias got hold of that information or discovered it. Presumably, probably neighbours gossiped about the men living in the house and the children going in and out. Anyway, the place was apparently put under surveillance, and then one day they stormed in and those two heroic lesbians were shot dead in their own home. Fortunately, at the time, the gay men who had been given refuge were all out trying to find work. So they survived and were able, of course, to tell the story. And likewise, they'd taken the young boys with them to try and get them work as well. So they all survived, but the two women who at incredible personal risk had done this, they died. And of course, for most people in Iraq, they are nameless. They'll always be nameless. They won't be recognized, maybe in decades to come. But I really think whenever I think about that story, those women knew the risk they were taking, but they did it because they believed in human rights, because they believed in the importance of LGBTI solidarity, and they paid with their lives. Another incident happened in Baghdad, when, in fact, one of the Iraqi exiles in London was actually doing a Skype call to the men in this safe house in Baghdad. Militias broke in and shot them dead while the call was going on. I mean, you can imagine the horror that you're on the end of a Skype call and suddenly the computer goes blank or falls over, and the next thing you hear all this shooting and screaming. That is sadly, the fate of LGBTI people in many countries. Not loads of countries, but many. I mean, you've all heard about what ISIS is doing in Syria and Iraq, the targeting and execution of people suspected of homosexuality. Some of you may have seen the photographs of the men being pushed off buildings. And it isn't, of course, just LGBTI people. Women, there's a shocking photographs of a woman who was accused of having sex outside of marriage being stoned to death. Unbelievable in this day and age that people could have such inhumanity. Of people being crucified, being tied to crosses and being crucified. So what I'm saying is, I acknowledge how things are going backwards, but I also recognize it's only in a relatively small number of countries, maybe 15, maybe 20 at the maximum, out of about 190 plus countries in the world. So I'd say that we should be anxious and concerned, but we shouldn't be over pessimistic, because globally overall the trend is towards greater LGBTI equality and acceptance. So just in the last year or so, homosexuality has been decriminalized in the Pacific state of Palau and in northern Cyprus. Astonishingly, recently, a leading spokesperson for the BJP party in India, which is by many definitions quite right-wing and traditionally very homophobic, has come out in favor of decriminalizing homosexuality. Long before Britain, Argentina and Uruguay legislated same-sex marriage. In Nepal, just in the last couple of weeks, a parliamentary committee has recommended the legalization of same-sex marriage. And there are debates about the issue in Vietnam, Taiwan, and Cuba. There hasn't been legislated yet, but they're talking about it. And that is, of course, an important first step. And incidentally, in the case of Vietnam, only about a month ago, there was a ban on same-sex marriage in Vietnam, and that was lifted. They haven't legalized it yet, but the ban has been lifted. So you can see the way things are going in a positive direction in many, many countries. I think what surprised a lot of people and gave a lot of people really hope, and it was very unexpected, the African Commission on Human Rights, which is part of the African Union, recommended an end to the persecution of LGBTI people. For those who don't know, the African Union has its own human rights charter. It's called the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And it states in the first few articles that all African citizens are entitled to equal treatment and to protection against discrimination. But of course, it's been routinely ignored and decried by many African nations. Thanks to the persistent, courageous, determined, passionate lobbying of LGBTI activists, the African Commission made this really positive statement. I'm not saying it's the best statement that was ever made, but it was an affirmation of LGBTI human rights. Unexpected and flying in the face of the practice of most African countries. It doesn't solve everything, of course. It's just a declaration. But it's the beginning. It's the beginning, it's the symbolic start, the gesture which says we are included. And for many African nations, that is a really, really big thing. When we look at the Human Rights Council, we've seen in recent years a succession of statements and declarations in support of LGBTI rights. So in the wake of the 2008 declaration of the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council is increasingly making pro-LGBTI noises and statements and affirmations. The same with the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. We have never had a UN Secretary General before who has been so positive and so supportive of LGBTI issues. He hasn't spoken out once or twice, but I'd say easily a dozen times in the last couple of years in support of an end to homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And that, of course, sends a signal. It sends a signal to countries around the world that LGBTI rights are human rights. And that won't change things overnight, but it sets a benchmark. It signals to countries that pursue the persecution of LGBTI people that this is not endorsed by the United Nations. I look elsewhere and think about some of the court judgments. In Russia, a court halted the prosecution of the LGBTI organization coming out in St. Petersburg. It was up for a prosecution, and normally the Russian courts just follow the Kremlin line. But in this particular case, only a few months back, the court said no, this is against the Russian constitution, which of course guarantees equality and human rights, freedom of expression. That was a very, very brave decision by a judge, in contrast to so many other judgments. So I've been in Moscow when LGBT pride has been banned. I've been in Moscow when the activists there have gone to court to appeal the ban on the basis that the right to protest and freedom of expression is guaranteed in the Constitution. And even though it's written there in black and white, crystal clear, incontestable, still judges will say, no case to answer, the ban is upheld. Well, here's a case of a court saying, no, this is a step too far. There was also an attempt to prosecute the organizer of the 404, Children 104 website, which provides online support to young LGBTI teenagers, just giving them, confidence and affirmation about their sexuality, informing them about their rights, educating them about safer sex and so on. That prosecution also failed. So even in Russia, where the courts are so politically controlled, still we are winning every now and then some gains. We're having some setbacks, but we're also having some gains. I mentioned earlier that the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda was thrown out by the courts. It was on a legal technicality that the decision to legislate took place in Parliament when there was not a proper quorum. But again, the courts in Uganda are very much, for the most part, not in every case, very much under the thumb of President Yoweri Museveni. But the courts on this occasion said, no, this was not a lawful legislation. And so we're now back to square one. The new anti-gay law has been effectively annulled, and the replacement new anti-gay law has not yet come to fruition. When we look around the world at pride parades, in so many countries where they've previously been banned or subjected to either police harassment or harassment by far-right and xenophobic organizations, gradually, slowly, those prides are succeeding and taking place. So all the years that Belgrade Pride in Serbia struggled to take place, often there were excuses, we can't allow it to go ahead because of security concerns. Which the organisers said, well, provide the security. The state has vast numbers of police and military personnel to provide the security, but they wouldn't. So the upshot was that for many years, Belgrade Pride either did not take place or eventually did take place under huge police protection, and even then the marchers were often attacked. In Singapore, where the last year the High Court threw out a legal challenge to the ban on homosexuality, despite that lack of success, the Pink Dot LGBTI protest last year had 20,000 people. And Singapore is a tiny nation, yet 20,000 people turned out for the Pink Dot LGBTI celebration. Quite clearly, public opinion and the confidence of the LGBTI movement in Singapore is growing. And that's really, really inspiring and encouraging, because the government there is so repressive, not just on LGBTI issues, but on a whole range of human rights and civil liberties issues. And what's also really inspiring is the way in which, in many cases, LGBTI movements are linking up with mainstream civil and human rights organizations, with women's groups, and sometimes with particular political parties to strengthen the mutual solidarity, to build alliances and coalitions. So in Uganda, they have a coalition which has, I think, about 50 different organizations. LGBTI ones are a small fragment. You know, there's women's groups, trade unions, legal groups, journalists, and so on. But they all work together, all for one and one for all. And that coalition has supported the LGBTI movement in Uganda. And in return, the LGBTI movement has supported the wider, broader struggle for democracy and human rights in Uganda. Now, what I'd say is that, dreadful though the backlash is, sadly, regrettably, backlash is often part of the process of making change. I'm old enough to remember the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States in the 1960s. And some of you may have seen the film Selma. There's often a sanitized version of that struggle. I can remember the nightly news bulletins where they would tell about how, in the wake of the civil rights movement, violent attacks and lynchings of black people actually increased. And indeed, Martin Luther King and his colleagues were often criticized by some black people, saying, your struggle has made things worse. There are more attacks upon black churches and homes and shops. There are more black people being lynched as a result of your campaign. Now, that was probably a minority point of view, but there were some people who felt that. To which the response of the Black Civil Rights Movement was, yes, we're sorry, we feel your pain. We never wanted this. But we will never ever get our freedom if we allow ourselves to be pushed around. We have to take a stand. And so many African Americans correctly realize that sometimes sacrifice and pain is part of the process of liberation. It's not that anybody wants it, but sometimes when you're faced with such bigotry and intolerance, some people are going to suffer. And of course you have to weigh up the pros and cons. Is it really worth it? Well, I would say in the case of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US, that most of the activists deplore that escalation in racist violence, but also think it was a price not worth paying, never worth paying, but a price that was paid in order to secure an end to the denial of voting rights and an end to segregation. So with that historical perspective, I apply that to the contemporary struggle for LGBTI freedom. Backlash is part of the process of change. The fact there is backlash shows that we are winning, that the defenders of the status quo, the hardline homophobes, biphobes and transphobes, are on the back foot. They're lashing out because they know that they are on the losing side of history. It's like the last desperate backlash of the slaveholders in the Deep South, the brutalities they inflicted upon slaves as slavery came to an end. Well, you know, as I said, it's nothing that we would ever want or wish. We would always seek to avoid it. But sometimes it happens. Sometimes these dreadful things happen. We have to minimize it. We have to try and guard against it, but sometimes it happens. And I think that looking at the overall trend, as I say, I see it as a positive trend worldwide. I see the movement for LGBTI freedom an unstoppable global trend. There may be backlash, we may have setbacks, but overall the trajectory is forward. And that is thanks to the inspirational, awesome activists in so many of these countries who personally risk their freedom and even their lives to advance the LGBTI cause. And I also pay tribute to the straight allies. In Uganda, for example, the humanist movement there has been in the forefront of supporting LGBTI people. And they have personally suffered backlash. One of their leading members, Kato Makasa, who has been outspoken against the anti-gay laws and the homophobic rhetoric of politicians and preachers. Not long ago, his car was bombed or set on fire. There have been other cases of the humanist leader in Nigeria, because he spoke out in defense of LGBTI rights, was attacked himself. And then when they couldn't sufficiently deter him, they attacked or threatened his parents, his elderly parents. You know, these people are awesome advocates, awesome, courageous defenders of human rights. And in fighting for LGBTI rights, they're not only defending LGBTI communities, they're also expanding the domain of rights for everyone. Because every victory won against a homophobic or repressive regime is a social gain for everyone. It inspires others in other movements, in other communities to think, yes, we too can do that. Yes, if we fight and stand, we can win as well. And that's incredibly important and empowering. I know from activists in Zimbabwe and many other countries that when they saw the LGBTI movement standing up against Mugabe, for example, they saw that guts, that determination, that courage, and it inspired them in the same way as when LGBTI people saw trade unionists and students, lawyers and church people standing up against Mugabe, it inspired them. You know, we are part of a global movement. LGBTI rights are human rights. We are part of the fundamental global movement for human rights. And we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with all those other people, all those other minorities and communities, and majorities in the case of women, who are also striving for their rights and freedoms. Because together, we're strong. Divided, we're weak. So my closing thought is that, yes, queer freedom is an unstoppable global trend. And yes, we can and will make homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia history. Thank you. So this is the interactive part. I invite you to make your own contributions, ask questions. Criticism is fine. It's your call, your floor. Who'd like to start? Okay.
Actually, one thing I would say, I mean, I remember as a I think a very young child. My memory from my early life is really, really poor. But one of my memories is being a really, really young child, and I guess it must have been the campaign for homosexual equality or something. And I remember my mother dragging me away from these like horrible people. You know, oh how things have changed in the British Isles since then, and certainly over the last even 15 years. I suppose my question though is, if there's one thing that we can do, because I mean, things have much improved in the British Isles, but that's obviously not true in quite the same way for the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is a long way away. And you know, if there's one thing we can do in the rest of the world? Is there one simple thing that we can do, or to kind of improve things? How can we engage with the issues that you've been talking about?
Well, I always say,
like, the rest of the world's a long way away, and I think it's hard to know what to do.
Yeah, well, I always say that it'd be great if LGBTI groups in Western countries could twin with LGBTI groups in developing countries or poorer former Eastern European countries, to support them, to publicise what they're doing, and to provide small amounts of resources. I can remember in the late 1980s I was contacted by a gay activist in Thailand who wanted to set up an LGBTI group, and he wanted advice on how to do it. And I said to him, well, what kind of things do you need? And he said, well, obviously I need a mobile phone, a camera, a computer, all those kind of basic simple things. And I was able to help with others, help get him the funds to buy those things. So the total was probably, I don't know, maybe £500, but that was the seeds, the ground seeds that actually enabled that movement to begin and take off. The other thing he said at one point was, we've got an emerging HIV crisis among gay and bisexual men in Thailand. We need to educate people. Can you help us? So I went to the Terence Higgins Trust, one of the main HIV and AIDS organisations in this country, and got lots of their promotional material. All of it was in English, of course, but quite a lot of people in Thailand do speak English, and they were able to then use and distribute that literature, but also, where appropriate, translate it into Thai. They basically just used the existing leaflets, they adapted them to fit with Thai culture. So it was a really easy, simple thing to do. Now, I would urge, if you're going to think about doing that, if you're thinking about twinning, don't please all go to Uganda. Uganda is very well supported. There's lots of places like Moldova and the Ukraine and Albania in the European sphere, and then beyond that, in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, there are lots of smaller, more isolated and less well-resourced groups who you could really simply help in a very easy way.
I love the idea of twinning. Is there an organisation that who could help set up those twins? How would you go about actually organising or finding a twin?
That's a very good point. There should be an organisation. There isn't.
There isn't something that can kind of help with that.
But you could go via ILGA, the International Gay and Lesbian Association, and get their advice and information from them about, which smaller, less well-resourced groups in developing countries could do with the assistance.
I absolutely love the twinning ideas.
Yeah.
If we can find a way of taking that forward, that'd be really good. Yeah.
Anybody else?
With regards to the reaction from Western governments, for example, in 2011, David Cameron said that he's going to threaten to cut aid to countries with anti-gay laws. Do you think that's actually beneficial to gay minorities in those countries, or it might actually lead to more problems?
Well, the first point to note is that, according to the government, that was misreporting. The government said at the time, and I actually had a meeting with the then International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell. He assured me that the government's policy was that aid was going to be conditional on a number of factors. So things like respect for human rights, including LGBTI rights, but also good governance, financial probity, and proven demonstrable success in reducing poverty. So there are 4 or 5 different dimensions to the conditionality of aid. But the government's policy was not to take the aid away, but to switch it. So, for example, in Malawi, most British government aid was taken away from the Malawian government, partly on LGBTI issues, but also on corruption and other issues. But it wasn't removed entirely. It was switched to local government organisations and Malawian NGOs that did not discriminate. So that, to me, is the right approach. If we say take away the aid or cut the aid, what we're saying is we're prepared to allow poor, vulnerable people to suffer. People who need aid for clean water, food, basic medical care. ordinary people should not be penalised for the homophobic policies of their governments. They need their aid, but it should be taken from those who are homophobic or in any way prejudiced, whether it be ethnic prejudice, prejudice against women, and put to those organisations that do not discriminate. That, to me, is the way to proceed.
Okay.
Is that not a similar argument that was launched against sanctions against South Africa when it had apartheid in the before the 90s?
Do you want to explain a bit more?
That businesses and tradesmen in South Africa would lose out, and that it wouldn't solve the problem of racism when the key leaders of the campaign against the apartheid were asking for sanctions as a price worth paying.
Yeah, well, I think when the call comes from organisations within the country who are recognised and have general support, then I think it may be justifiable to cut all aid or to impose sanctions or boycotts. And that call from the African National Congress came from within South Africa as a mass popular demand. So it wasn't about Britain imposing its policies or deciding for the people. It was us responding to what the people, the majority in South Africa, wanted. So I think that's different. So if, for example, in Malawi, the main opposition and other human rights organisations said we want all aid stopped, then I think we'd have to consider that very carefully and probably follow their lead. But that's not what's happened. So I think the switching aid rather than cutting it is the way to go for the moment anyway.
Obviously nowadays it's a global economy. Are there any multinational companies doing anything to address this or to apply sanctions, etc.?
I mean, there is quite a move among Western companies who operate in other countries where there is anti-LGBTI legislation to be clearly supportive of LGBTI staff and to include non-discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity within their remit. But of course, many of these organisations operate within a framework of they're dependent on the toleration or acceptance of the government. So there's limits to what they can do. In some countries, they're able to have LGBTI staff networks. In other countries, that would mean potential arrest and the closing down of their entire operations. So it's a very fine balancing act. But I think you're right. Big international companies do have an ethical responsibility to use their power and influence as far as they can to defend all human rights. Not just LGBTI rights, but all human rights for everyone. And how they do that will, of course, vary from one country to another. It's probably easier to do it in Indonesia or the Philippines than it is in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or Iran. So that's a dilemma. I think also there is a very strong economic argument that isn't often put to governments about their anti-LGBTI laws. And there are two basic arguments. First of all, if you have a repressive anti-LGBTI regime, Western tourists, which many of these countries depend upon for a substantial proportion of their income, will not come. Not only LGBTI tourists won't come, but even their straight friends and allies won't come, because they won't want to holiday in a country where there is repression. So that's one point. The second point is that by having anti-LGBTI laws, it results in an LGBTI brain drain. In other words, LGBTI people in Uganda or Nigeria can't, for the most part, can't wait to leave to go to another country where they'll be safe and secure and accepted. And that means that all their educational qualifications, their skills, their experience is lost to the home economy. And that's bad for business. It's bad for the country's economy. So those are two, I think, quite compelling arguments as to why, in addition to the human rights ones, which are the most important of all, but there are additional arguments as to why things should change.
Do you think that part of the resistance to getting rid of anti-gay laws is the fact that people are afraid of change and are unwilling to accept that change is eventually going to happen?
I think there's a constellation of factors. I mean, in some countries, I think homophobia, biphobia and transphobia is used as a political football. So, for example, in Uganda, demonising LGBTI people takes the public's mind away from the failings, corruption and tyranny of the government. The government can point to LGBTI people as the enemy within. Very similar to the way in which the Nazis used that tactic against the Jews. The enemy within the Jews. They're the problem. So Uganda has a huge raft of problems and issues. Corruption, nepotism, ethnic strife, the suppression of civil liberties, the failure to tackle real poverty. And for the government there to vilify and demonise LGBTI people is a very convenient scapegoat because it distracts people's attention. So that's one tactic. The other one is that in all these countries, organised religion is often a driving force for anti-LGBTI policies. So when you look at Russia with the Orthodox Church, or Uganda with the Church of Uganda, which is part of the Global Anglican Communion, you see that these organisations are in the forefront of demanding greater repression of LGBTI people. And that's why it's very important that we address religious communities. In Uganda, there are brave, heroic Christians who are standing out against this. Bishop Christopher Senyonjo in Uganda, he was a former senior bishop of the Church of Uganda, part of the Anglican Communion. Because he spoke out in defence of LGBTI people, he was dismissed, denied the right to officiate at services, and they even took away his pension. He's an elderly man, about 80 years old. He's suffered terribly because of his stand. And our Anglican leaders in this country, Justin Welby and before him Rowan Williams, did, as far as I can see, nothing or next to nothing to defend brave Christopher Senyonjo. So, the allies are there, they need supporting. And the great shame of the Anglican Church in this country is that too often it has appeased the very clerical bigots who are persecuting LGBTI people. So you can remember the way in which successive archbishops of Canterbury cozied up to extremist homophobic bishops and archbishops in both Nigeria and Uganda. They didn't speak out against them, they sought to appease them. They wanted to keep them within the Anglican fold at any price, including silence about their active persecution of LGBTI people. Just recently, there was an equivalent in Nigeria, whose name I can't remember, a Catholic bishop, who last year spoke out against the criminalisation of persecution of LGBTI people. A very, very brave thing to do in Nigeria. Now, he did say that homosexuality is wrong, it's sinful, it's against the Christian faith. But in the context of Nigeria, for him to say the criminalisation of persecution of LGBT people is wrong, that was fantastic. And he's one of the very, very few clerics in Nigeria who've ever said anything against the repression there that LGBTI people face.
I might have got this totally wrong, but when you're talking about the twinning, Western societies with developing societies, do you think, as in England, that we are, or the United Kingdom, that we are at a stage where we can twin and give knowledge? For the research I've been looking at with the NHS and physicians and nurses not having enough knowledge to be able to support people when they're transitioning into their perceived gender that they think they're in.
Yeah.
Do you think we're there yet to support somebody if we've not finished our journey of looking?
Well, all these things are relative. You know, compared to many other countries, we've made huge positive strides. And I want to thank all of you who've been involved in that process, because without you, the grassroots, this wouldn't have happened. But it doesn't mean that we have done everything right or the battle is complete. You know, there is still elements of legal discrimination in this country, and certainly there are prejudiced attitudes, there's discrimination, there's harassment, there's hate crime, there's bullying in schools. You know, we have a way to go yet. But by comparison to many other countries, we have moved forward in a very positive way. And I think that gives us a special obligation to look to and defend those who are in a more vulnerable position. It's not saying that we know it all. We don't. As I said, there are people in those countries who are also fierce defenders of LGBTI people. But I think it is about the principle of solidarity, of compassion, of our common humanity, that we look to and support those in other countries who are more vulnerable, more threatened, who have fewer resources, and who face far graver consequences than we can ever imagine. That's the way I see it.
Hi, I was really interested in your experience as an activist and in the face of just huge brutality and oppression and painfully slow incremental progress, which at times can be exhausting and painful. How do you keep going?
How do I keep going? Often with difficulty. I had about 2 hours sleep last night. Not by choice, or not because I'm some superhuman person who only needs 2 hours sleep. I need 8 hours. But I'm doing so many different simultaneous campaigns. It just means that sleep was one of the things that went to the wall last night. I suppose one of the things that keeps me going is looking at the successes that I've contributed to. Of course, it's never about me alone. It's always about working with others and supporting others, and collectively, cumulatively, together we make the change. But when I think, for example, in this country, of all the people over the years I've helped, victims of homophobic bullying in schools, anti-LGBT hate crime in the street, LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers, people in ethnic and religious minority communities who often face comparatively extreme persecution, you know, I look at the difference that I've helped make to their lives, and that's what inspires me. That's what keeps me going. When I think that, you know, I can contribute towards a positive change. You probably know that in this country, when it comes to asylum, the rate of refusal for LGBTI refugees on a first application is very, very high, much higher than average. And it's because the system is sort of rigged. You know, legal aid has been cut, so no solicitor has enough money to prepare a proper case. Often the refugees are put in asylum detention centres, which are effectively prisons by another name. They don't have the freedom to get the resources, to get the information, to get the evidence to support their claim. Some of them are put on fast track and only given a couple of weeks to prepare a claim, which is impossible. But in the case of the individuals that we help, I think in the last year or so, we've helped about 85, maybe 80, 85, 90 LGBTI refugees. And of those who've had an adjudication, every single one, with one exception, has won asylum, which is way, way, way above the national average. And even in that case, it's going to appeal. So, you know, but I think to myself also, why should these genuine refugees have to depend upon my intervention, the intervention of other supporting organisations in order to win? You know, why is it that if they're left to their own solicitor, the chances are they're going to fail, even though they've got a genuine, sincere and positive case that deserves refugee status? that's one thing. And then I suppose looking around the world, I mean, I look at all the different campaigns I've been involved in over the last 48 years and can point to so many extraordinary successes. Again, not by me alone, not by a long shot, but I've been there with others, and together we've made the change. You mentioned South Africa. You know, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement for 20 years. And, you know, what joy I felt, personal joy, at the success of African LGBTI people, both black and white, in South Africa, in securing that change. Some of you, I don't know, any of you, did anybody here know about Balochistan? Anybody know where Balochistan is? Balochistan is effectively about half of the area of Pakistan. It was an independent kingdom up until the late 1800s. And then it became a British protectorate, but with its own self-governance and self-rule. And then in 1947, along with India and Pakistan, Britain granted it independence. For 1 year, they were an independent state. And then Pakistan invaded and annexed the territory. And it's been under military occupation ever since. Now, about 10 years ago or so, some activists from Balochistan contacted me and said, look, you're very good at profiling issues or raising awareness. Can you help us? Nobody knows about our struggle. Nobody knows what's happening in our country. So I began to write a series of articles and organize some protests in London to highlight what was happening. You know, American and British supplied weapons, which are supposed to be used against the Taliban, are being diverted to suppress a genuine popular national liberation struggle by the people of Balochistan. And unlike the rest of Pakistan, Balochistan is much more secular. They don't have, or until recently, haven't had the fanatical religious extremism of the rest of Pakistan. So it's a much more liberal version of Islam. I'm not saying it's perfect and, you know, exactly the kind of Islam that reconciles with democracy and human rights in its entirety, but certainly it's much more progressive than the rest of Pakistan. I've never mentioned explicitly that I'm gay, but of course when people Google me, they find out that I am, and there's been a huge debate within Balochistan and within the wider Pakistan human rights movement. What's this about this gay guy in England helping the people of Balochistan? And there's been a real, I haven't engineered it or encouraged it, it's just happened. But I've been amazed at the people who've contacted me who said, look, you've really changed my attitude. I used to despise gay people, I thought they should be, you know, stoned to death, but you've supported our struggle, so therefore I've changed my views. I think, you know, live and let live. And that's quite amazing because Balochistan is not, I mean, it's starved of resources. I mean, it's the most rich part of, the reason why it was annexed was because it's got all the gold, the oil and the minerals. Yet it's the poorest part of the country. And most people there don't have gas supplies or electricity, even though it's the source of most of Pakistan's gas and electricity. But people just said, you know, because you've supported us, you know, we're not going to be, you know, treat gay people in that way anymore. I'm not saying that all people have said that. There are some people still who are probably quite hostile, and I know one of the American-based Baluch campaigners is openly gay and gets a lot of stick and is attacked a lot with the homophobic abuse. But he also gets support. People come to his defence. I can remember we organised a protest outside the American embassy some years ago against Americans supplying the fighter aircraft and attack helicopters that were being used to bomb and strafe Balochistan villages. And there were lots of men there in full beards and traditional Pashtun and other Baluch clothing. And I didn't expect it or ask for it, but the speaker introduced me as, and now can we welcome Peter Tatchell, who supported our cause. He's a very famous gay rights campaigner. And you saw the faces in the crowd. But after I spoke, quite a lot of those, you know, older men in the full beards and the turbans and everything who you thought might have been really hostile came and said, We're really pleased you're here. Thank you for your support. So it does show that if we stand for the principle of universal human rights, lots of other people who perhaps previously may not have supported us might rethink their stand. And that's what keeps me going. I'm an eternal optimist. I believe that, despite all the setbacks and all the suffering, that good will ultimately win. Any other questions, contributions? Challenge me. If you disagree with anything I've said, I'm open to being challenged, and we can have a debate about these issues. That's fine by me. Okay.
Did you? I'm doing sort of on a personal thing again. Did you have an idea when you were younger that this was going to be your path, or is it something? I don't want you to talk about personal issues, but is there something? Was there a moment in your life that set you on this path, or was it just your general experience? No.
Not really. I grew up in a very small C conservative working class family in Melbourne, Australia in the 1960s. My father was a factory worker. My mother was sometimes worked in a factory and sometimes just did housewife. But nothing in my entire extended family ever inclined me towards any kind of social conscience. My parents were not interested in politics. They tended to vote for sort of the Conservative Party in Australia, the Liberals. They weren't engaged in any kind of social or community activism or nothing at all. In terms of analysing why I've turned out the way I am, I can only speculate. But I would say that a number of things probably worked for it. First of all, my mother suffered from severe, chronic, life-threatening asthma. And that meant that a lot of our income was spent on hospital and medical bills. And I, from a very early age, from the age of 8 or 9 onwards, had to effectively, for a long period, bring up, be the father, mother to my younger half-brother and half-sisters. And I can remember thinking at an early age how unjust and unfair it was that simply because of my mother's ill health, we were so poor. In those days, there was no National Health Service in Australia. So that was one thing, and I suppose that may have burned my sense of injustice and my passion for justice. Then I can also remember in 1963 either reading or viewing a report about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. And that's the first time I guess I thought politically. I remember thinking just how horrifying it was to think that anybody could kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in a church on Sunday morning. I just couldn't understand. But then, of course, I studied and learned about the Black Civil Rights Movement and understood about racism. That made me a lifelong anti-racist. And then when I was 15, that was when I was, 11? When I was 15, that was the first ever campaign I did, which was against the death penalty. In 1967, in February 1967, a man called Ronald Ryan was due to be hanged for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder during an escape. And I remember at the age of 15 reading an autopsy report. Well, it wasn't a report, it was just a summary of the autopsy report in the local paper. And it described the trajectory of the bullet through the warder's body. And I worked out at the age of 15, well, the alleged killer, Ronald Ryan, was standing over there. The warder was over there. How could the bullet shoot through the air and do a semi-U-turn? That's just not physically possible. Or at least, it's highly doubtful. To me, it is not guilt beyond reasonable doubt. So I got involved. My first ever campaign was against the death penalty to try and save that man. Unfortunately, the campaign was not successful. We had an extreme right-wing conservative government in the state of Victoria at the time. An election was coming up. the government wanted to get the law and order vote. So it went ahead with the execution despite this doubt, and despite witness statements from other people, I think even including prison warders, who suggested that the fatal bullet may have been accidentally fired by another warder in pursuit. That execution had a really unnerving effect upon me. It made me question authority. I thought to myself, how can I trust the government, the police, the courts, if they're prepared to execute a man where there's at least some doubt about whether he fired that fatal bullet? And so it made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. You know, I never take what the authorities say for granted. I don't necessarily say it's wrong, but I'm skeptical, questioning. I want to investigate. I don't want to accept it because they say it. And that has led me, of course, to question so many other things. Then I began to question Australia's role in the war in Vietnam alongside the Americans, and discover the truth, the truth about how the United States intervened to stop democratic free elections in Vietnam because they feared the communists would win. How we were propping up a dictatorial regime in South Vietnam, in Saigon, that was indulging in grotesque human rights abuses. And then I questioned the way in which the Aboriginal people of Australia were being treated. Growing up in Melbourne, in my entire childhood, I only ever saw one other Aboriginal person, who was a boy at my brother's school. Aborigines were kept far away, not locked up, but everything was to keep them on reserves and out of the cities, out of the major towns. But I began to question that, and I read a report that many young Aboriginal kids were dropping out of school because their parents needed their income to help support the family. So together with some of the students, we had a discussion. What can we do about this? So we hit on the idea of trying to provide scholarships for Aboriginal kids so they could stay on at school, get the skills, and become, effective people in their communities, to uplift their communities, to be advocates for the rights and freedoms of Aboriginal people. Now, this idea came into our heads, and we did a bit of research, and we discovered that in fact there was a scheme already set up by some students at Melbourne University. So I think 4 of us went to meet these students in Melbourne University. We were at high school, we were 15 years of age. And they explained the scheme. It was called ABSCOL. So we said, let's set up one that we'll call it the Aboriginal Scholarship Educational Incentive Foundation. I think that's a fund, yeah. And so we got together, we wrote to all the schools around the whole southeast Melbourne area, and decided to jointly organise a big sponsored walk to raise money for these scholarships. To be honest, I can't remember any longer exactly how much we raised, but by those standards in those days, it was a vast, huge amount. We did it through a sponsored walk along the beaches. And of course, in those days, we never heard of a sponsored anything before. It was entirely new. So we sort of invented this idea of doing something and getting sponsorship for it to raise money. So it raised this huge amount of money. And I'm very proud to say that scholarship incentive fund still exists today. And it's helped many, many Aboriginal kids stay in at school, get qualifications, become journalists, lawyers, doctors, dentists, social workers. It has really been a tool of empowerment. So that's a little flavour of how I began, and how I've been going ever since. Someone else had another question? Yeah.
I'm doing a human rights module at the moment, and one of the issues we're looking at is the difference between universalism and relativism, and how, in some ways, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been seen or accused of being, by some people, sort of a Western version of doing things, and how we should be more culturally relative and more culturally sensitive. to other places in the world that might not share some of our views. I'm not saying I agree with it, it's just an argument that's been put forward.
Yeah.
How do you, have you ever faced that issue in some ways, and how do you combat that, and how do you remain culturally sensitive whilst putting forward human rights?
I've certainly faced it many, many times, and been ferociously attacked and denounced for defending the principle of universal human rights, which is based on the idea that everybody on this planet is entitled to human rights. Once you start allowing exceptions, where do you end? What do you end up colluding with? But let's put a correction in from the start. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not drawn up entirely by Western people. It included people from all different cultures and continents. It had input from people from the global south. And of course, today, every member state of the United Nations signs up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're not, they're under no compulsion to do so, but they have. So we would say to them, you've signed up to it, you've accepted the principles, it's your duty to honour them. When you get into the realms of cultural relativism, that's a very, very, very dangerous area. Because it means that when it comes particularly to the rights of women and LGBTI people, the cultural relativists keep on making excuses. They say, well, these black and brown and yellow people, they're different from us. They have a different culture. There's no obligation to give them the rights that we demand and accept for ourselves. And that, to me, is a form of racism. It's saying that because of their culture and their race, their ethnicity, we treat them differently. My view is we're all part of the same human family. We have a common humanity, and we must defend all those members within that family. There can be arguments and disputes about which rights should exist and which rights shouldn't, but we have the foundation, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it has been adopted in its own form by the African Union. I mentioned the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. That wasn't a Western imposition. That was devised by the governments of Africa in the late 70s, and I think it became finalised in, 1981. So this was an indigenous, authentic African document. African nations set out the rights and freedoms that they believe were and are applicable to all their peoples. I think that in many cases, a good example is the way in which the term Islamophobia is thrown around. When I defend Muslim minorities, I'm often accused by other Muslims or some far-left people of being Islamophobic. So if I defend Ahmadi Muslims who are persecuted in many countries of the world, and even here suffer discrimination by fellow Muslims in Britain, they're saying I'm pandering to an EDL anti-Muslim agenda. My response is, no, I'm not. I'm defending the rights of all Muslim people. Likewise, when I oppose Sharia law, they say you're not culturally sensitive. You must respect the cultures of other people. You must respect other faiths. Well, I say, I respect all other people. I defend the human rights of all other people, but I do not feel obliged to defend and respect reactionary, sexist, misogynistic, racist, homophobic, biphobic, transphobic faiths, political beliefs, or anything else. By using those by applying double standards, you're betraying the people who most need the protection, and for whom those laws and those legislations, those conventions on human rights were devised. I make a very clear distinction between faith fanatics, whether they be Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, or whatever, I make a distinction between the fanatics, the fundamentalists, the extremists, and the people of the faith as a whole. Most British Muslims do not want gay people stoned to death. Sharia law may say it or oblige it, but most British Muslims do not. Even in many other countries, there are many Muslim people, even in developing countries in the global south, many Muslim people who reject elements of Sharia law as being culturally specific from a particular era and no longer applicable. But I've been to 2 or 3 conferences in the last year or so where Muslims and ex-Muslims have spoken out, and they have been denounced for defending universal human rights. They've been called traitors, anti-Muslim, and many things worse, racists, Islamophobes, for simply telling their stories about the persecution they suffered under Islamic regimes, which mirrors, of course, the kind of persecution that Christian regimes once did. You think of when, in the medieval period, when the Catholic Church had great power, the burning of heretics at the stake. Well, ISIS is the modern invocation of that. So I think, it does require some careful negotiation, but I think at the end of the day, we do have to stand by the principle of universal human rights. Because if we don't, we're saying to some people, you aren't worthy, you don't deserve what we take for granted. I mean, in Britain, if sections of our society were being subjected to barbaric treatments, all progressive people would rise up and condemn it. But when it happens in some other countries, whether it be politically based or religiously based, many Western liberals and left-wingers look the other way or actively say that we have to accept this is their culture. So my view is, everybody has a culture, everybody has human rights. Human rights are not negotiable. We must respect the person, but we mustn't respect cultures that oppress others. So when in our own community, LGBTI community, there are people who are racist or anti-Muslim, we need to challenge that. Just because we're gay doesn't mean to say we get a free pass and we should ignore people within our own community who are misogynistic, for example. There are some gay and bisexual men who are quite sexist. That needs to be challenged based on the same principle of universal human rights. This might have to be the last one, or last 2, I think, yes?
Yeah. You talk about different cultures. What's your thoughts on the culture in education for embedding LGBT in the culture of the school or the college?
Well, of course, as you know, sex and relationship is not compulsory in every school. And many schools either don't do sex and relationship education, or it's very perfunctory, it's maybe just about reproduction, but not actually about sex and relationships. And a lot of schools don't deal with important issues like what is consent, what's abuse, what to do if you're being pestered for sex you don't want. No good just saying to people, phone Childline. People need the empowerment and confidence and encouragement